The airbase at Biskra is not much to look at in the winter of 1943. It sits at the northern edge of the Sahara Desert in eastern Algeria, roughly 300 miles west of the Tunisian border. The men of the 97th Bombardment Group live in canvas tents on the hardpan. Sand gets into everything. The engines cough it in the morning. The food tastes of it by noon. At night, the temperature drops faster than a man expects desert air to drop, and the thin tent walls do nothing useful against it. The 97th Group's mission on the morning of February 1st is to bomb the dock area at Tunis. The lead aircraft is piloted by Colonel Konrad Nekrasson, the group's commanding officer. Flying on his right wing is a B-17 F-5BO, serial number 41-24406, a bomber that has been with the 97th since the summer of 1942, that flew across the Atlantic in August of that year, that participated in the very first American bombing mission over France, and that was named All-American by its crew when they received it in 1942. The name comes from the crew itself. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, Jr. is from Savannah, Georgia, a Duke University football player who chose the Air Forces over the infantry and has ended up commanding a B-17 over North Africa. His crew, like the name suggests, has come from all corners of the United States, north and south, coasts and midlands, assembled by the machinery of the draft and the training pipeline into a 10-man team in the sky over the Mediterranean. They take off before dawn and form up in the darkness. What happens after they reach Tunis will produce one of the most extraordinary photographs of the entire Second World War and one of the most astonishing feats of airmanship in the history of aviation. Before the All-American can be understood, the machine itself must be understood. The Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress is 87 feet from nose to tail and just over 103 feet from wingtip to wingtip. Fully loaded, it weighs in the neighborhood of 65,000 pounds. 4 Wright 1820 Cyclone radio engines, each developing 1,200 horsepower, pull it through the sky at a cruising speed of approximately 200 miles per hour. Its operational ceiling is above 25,000 feet, where the temperature outside the aircraft is 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and the air is too thin to breathe without supplemental oxygen. It carries up to 8,000 pounds of bombs on its heaviest missions and is defended by 13 50-caliber Browning machine guns distributed in power turrets, waist windows, a ball turret under the belly, a nose position, and a tail position. In the period before long-range escort fighters are available to protect them, the B-17 formations are expected to defend themselves through massed firepower, flying tight enough together that the gun arcs of multiple aircraft overlap and create interlocking fields of fire. The theory is sounder than the practice. German and Italian fighter pilots have spent the preceding months working out the vulnerabilities in B-17 defensive coverage. The nose, before the introduction of the chin turret, is the weakest point. A head-on attack, coming in fast and breaking away at the last moment, can put cannon and machine gun fire through the windscreen and instrument panel before the limited nose guns can track and engage. This tactic costs the Luftwaffe dearly, too, because it requires nerve and split-second timing, and a pilot who miscalculates dies in the collision. But it is the most effective single approach to destroying a flying fortress. The B-17F's other defining characteristic, the one that will matter most on February 1st, is its structural integrity. Boeing engineers designed the B-17 with a level of structural redundancy that was, at the time of the aircraft's design, considered excessive by some reviewers. The fuselage is built on a series of oval frames connected by longitudinal stringers and covered in aluminum alloy skin that, while not thick enough to stop cannon shells, is thick enough and formed with sufficient curvature to distribute the loads of normal flight and extraordinary stress alike. The wing attachment fittings are overbuilt for the aircraft's design weight. The empennage, the tail assembly comprising the vertical fin, rudder, and horizontal stabilizers, is bolted to the aft fuselage through multiple attachment points designed to handle the aerodynamic loads of combat maneuvering. What this means, in practical terms, is that a B-17 can sustain damage that would destroy most other aircraft and continue to fly. The pilots who love it call this ruggedness. The German pilots who spend the war trying to shoot it down call it infuriating. Both descriptions are accurate. On the morning of February 1st, the All-American and its crew are about to put that structural redundancy to a test no Boeing engineer anticipated. The Messerschmitt Bf-109G, defending the skies over Tunisia in February of 1943, is a different aircraft from the one that contested the Battle of Britain 2.5 years earlier, and it is considerably better. The G series, nicknamed the Gustav by its pilots, entered service in 1942 and is powered by the Daimler-Benz DB605 engine, developing approximately 1,475 horsepower in its early variants and capable of significantly more with emergency boost systems engaged. It can reach a maximum speed of roughly 410 miles per hour at altitude. It climbs faster than any Allied fighter it regularly encounters in the Mediterranean theater. Its armament, in the configuration used over Tunisia in early 1943, includes a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 machine guns in the engine cowling. Its weakness is range. The Bf-109G carries relatively little fuel and cannot escort bombers on long missions without drop tanks. Over its home fields in Tunisia and Sicily, however, range is irrelevant. The Bf-109G pilots defending Tunis are fighting on their home ground with full fuel loads over targets they know intimately. Jagdgeschwader 53, the Pik-Ass-Geschwader, the Ace of Spades wing, is one of the Luftwaffe units defending Tunisia. It has been in continuous combat since the opening of the war and numbers among its personnel some of the most experienced fighter pilots in the German inventory. By early 1943, the pilots of JG-53 have developed a clear picture of B-17 tactics and B-17 vulnerabilities, and they attack accordingly. The pilot of the Bf-109G that collides with All-American on February 1st is identified in subsequent research as Feldwebel Erich Pachtzia, a 16-victory ace of I/Jagdgeschwader 53. He is attacking in conjunction with his element leader, Oberleutnant Julius Meinberg, a 31-victory ace who would survive the war and later write a memoir describing this engagement from the German perspective. Meinberg, flying lead, makes the first attack on the bomber formation from the front and breaks away. Pachtzia comes in on the second pass. What happens to Pachtzia in those final seconds is a matter of physics and probability. The defensive fire from the B-17 formation strikes Pachtsia's Bf-109G as he closes on the All-American. Whether he is killed outright, critically wounded, or simply knocked unconscious cannot be determined with certainty from the available records. What can be determined is the consequence. Pachtzia loses control of the aircraft at a moment when it is committed to an attack run that intersects the flight path of the All-American at a closing speed measured in hundreds of miles per hour. There is no time to avoid what happens next. Lieutenant Bragg sees it coming and does the only thing he can. He pushes the control column forward, trying to duck under the Bf-109G, trying to take the hit on the top of the fuselage rather than in the cockpit. He makes the decision in the fraction of a second available to him. The nose of the All-American drops. Bragg flinches as the German fighter passes inches over his head. What he feels in the cockpit of a 65,000-pound bomber is described in his own words as a slight thud, like a coughing engine. What is actually happening to the aircraft is vastly different from what it feels like. The wing of the Bf-109G, cutting diagonally through the rear section of the All-American's fuselage, severs the structure nearly all the way through. The cut is not clean. It is jagged, torn, with metal sheeting peeled back by the force of the impact and then folded rearward by the 200-mile-per-hour wind blast. The left horizontal stabilizer, the tail surface that controls the aircraft's pitch, is completely torn away. The left elevator, attached to that stabilizer, goes with it. The vertical fin and rudder are damaged but remain attached. The fuselage itself is connected at two small portions of the surviving frame, an upper remnant of structure and a lower section. Between these 2 points of attachment, the fuselage is essentially open on both sides. The tail section, from the collision point rearward, is hanging. It is not detached, it is hanging. Connected to the forward section of the fuselage by perhaps 2 narrow strips of aluminum alloy and a portion of the keel structure, it sways in the wind, oscillating with each change in airspeed, responding to turbulence with movements that the crew watching it can see and feel as a sickening, irregular shudder. All control cables running through the damaged section are severed except one. A single elevator cable still connects the cockpit to a portion of the remaining tail control surface. It is the only mechanical connection between Bragg's hands and the aircraft's pitch axis. One cable, stretched across a gap of torn fuselage and open sky. The electrical system is damaged, the oxygen system is damaged, the radio is partially out. The 2 outboard engines, numbers 1 and 4, are damaged and performing poorly. Bragg will eventually shut down one of them entirely. The Bf-109G that hit them has broken apart on impact. Its pieces fall away toward the Tunisian desert. The crew of All-American is left alone in the sky with an aircraft that has no right to be flying. The immediate question facing Bragg and his crew in the seconds after the collision is not whether the aircraft can make it home. That question is not yet on the table. The immediate question is whether the aircraft will stay in the air for the next 30 seconds. Bragg discovers as he takes stock of the controls that the aircraft wants to climb. The loss of the left horizontal stabilizer has destroyed the symmetry of the tail's aerodynamic forces. The remaining right stabilizer, producing lift on the right side of the tail assembly, is pushing the tail down on its side and the nose up on the other. To maintain level flight, Bragg has to push forward on the control column continuously, using his knees and both hands to hold pressure against a machine that is fighting him toward a stall. He has not yet told the crew what they are dealing with. He does not need to. Sam Sarpelis, the tail gunner, is stationed in the very section of the aircraft that has just been nearly severed. He is separated from the main body of the aircraft by the gap in the fuselage. The floor connecting his position to the rest of the aircraft is gone. He is in a compartment attached to the rest of the bomber by 2 narrow strips of metal, swaying in the slipstream, with open air visible through the sides of the fuselage where the skin has peeled back. He calls the situation in over the interphone to the waist gunners. He stays at his gun. This matters because Sarpelis's weight in the tail section is one of the factors keeping the remaining tail structure from oscillating itself to destruction. A tail hanging on 2 strips of metal with nothing in it would vibrate differently from a tail with 160 pounds of tail gunners seated in it. Whether Sarpelis understands this calculation or is simply choosing his duty over the option to move forward is not recorded. What is recorded is that he stays. Forward of the damage, the waist gunners, Sergeant Stanley Moody and Sergeant Ralph Burkhart, assess the situation. The open sides of the fuselage around the breakpoint create a wind tunnel effect through the interior of the aircraft. At 200 miles per hour of airspeed, the turbulence coming through the torn fuselage is violent enough that standing near the opening without holding something is not possible. One of the waist gunners is reportedly blown into the broken tail section when the bomb bay doors are momentarily opened. It takes several crew members and improvised lines made from parachute harness components to pull him back. He is retrieved. The crew all have their parachutes on. Bragg has not ordered a bailout. He has not ruled one out. He is still flying the aircraft, still holding the nose down against the aerodynamic pressure pushing it up, still reading his instruments as they continue to provide information. The aircraft is still over Tunisia, still over enemy territory, still under the guns of the Luftwaffe. The German pilots notice. A B-17 that has fallen out of formation, that is slowing, that is losing altitude, is not the same target as a B-17 in formation. In formation, a bomber is protected by the overlapping fields of fire from multiple aircraft. An aircraft alone in the sky is a target of opportunity, a straggler that every fighter in the area is trained to identify and finish. As the All-American falls behind its formation and the other B-17s continue their return to Biskra, the German pilots converge. Multiple fighters attack the damaged bomber over the return route. The crew engages them. This is, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The aircraft is barely holding together. The tail section is swaying. The fuselage has a gap in it. But the gunners are still at their stations, and 50 caliber machine guns function regardless of the condition of the aircraft around them. Staff Sergeant William H. Simpkins in the top turret is credited with destroying a Focke-Wulf Fw-190 during the running fight homeward. Sergeant Ralph Burkhardt, the right waist gunner, shoots down a Messerschmitt Me-210, the twin-engine heavy fighter that has been a presence over Tunisia all winter. Sergeant Stanley Moody, the left waist gunner, destroys another Bf-109 and probably shoots down a Bf-110 twin-engine fighter. All of this happens while the tail section hangs behind them like a flag in a hurricane. The tail gunner, Sarpolis, has to fire in short bursts rather than sustained fire. The recoil from the twin 50 calibers in his position creates a force that, transmitted through the damaged and largely unsupported tail structure, is enough to yaw the aircraft off course. He learns this on the first burst and compensates. Short bursts keep the torque down, keep the aircraft straight. He is, in effect, adjusting his shooting to accommodate the physics of a structure that should not still be in the air. The German fighters eventually break off. The reasons they do are not entirely clear from the available record. The sustained and accurate return fire from the All-Americans' gunners is one factor. The demonstration that this aircraft, impossibly damaged, is still fighting, may be another. Fighter pilots who engage a straggler expect a straggler to behave like a straggler. This one is not behaving like anything the Luftwaffe doctrine anticipated. The All-American continues westward. The distance from Tunis to Biskra is approximately 300 miles. Bragg cannot fly that 300 miles in a straight line. Every change in heading requires a banked turn, and a banked turn requires the aircraft to sustain lateral aerodynamic loads that the damaged fuselage may not be able to handle. Bragg and his co-pilot have worked out, through the most direct possible form of experimentation, that the aircraft will tolerate very gentle turns, executed at a rate that keeps the G-loading on the structure as low as possible. To turn around and point toward home, the All-American covers nearly 70 miles. 70 miles. A turn radius of 70 miles, because a tighter turn might tear the tail off entirely. The aircraft is also losing altitude, not dramatically, not in a dive, but in a slow and continuous descent driven by the degraded performance of the damaged engines and the aerodynamic penalty imposed by the torn fuselage and the hanging tail. Bragg keeps the aircraft flying as level as he can manage, uses what power he has to maintain airspeed, and accepts the altitude loss as the price of not overstressing the structure. He is flying by feel. The instruments that survive are giving him partial information. The elevator cable that remains intact is giving him partial pitch authority. Everything else is being managed through experience and judgment. Navigator Harry Newsley is calculating. He has a working position and a working set of instruments for determining position and course. He feeds Bragg the headings. Bragg flies them. The corrections are incremental. Each heading change an exercise in caution. Each degree of bank a small bet against the integrity of the remaining fuselage structure. The crew can see the tail through the gaps in the fuselage. They can watch it sway. They can feel it when it moves, a rhythmic shudder transmitted forward through the two remaining attachment points, through the frames and stringers of the undamaged section, into the seats and floors and instrument panels of the forward fuselage. It is like feeling the heartbeat of a dying machine. Radio contact with the base at Biskra is intermittent. The damaged electrical system limits what the radio operators can accomplish. Some transmissions get through. The base knows the aircraft has been damaged. The base does not yet know how badly. The Allied pilots who intercept the All-American as it approaches the Algerian coast see something that takes a moment to process. The formation of B-17s from the morning mission has long since landed. The All-American is alone, flying low, flying slowly, leaving a thin trail of smoke from one of its damaged engines. The pilots who close to visual range transmit back to Biskra what they are observing. The empennage is waving like a fishtail, they report. They do not believe the aircraft will make it to land. They request that boats be positioned to rescue the crew when the bomber comes down in the water. Their assessment is professionally sound. What they are looking at is a B-17 whose tail section is visibly oscillating in flight, connected to the forward section by an amount of metal that, from the outside, looks insufficient to hold a house together, let alone an aircraft traveling at 150 miles per hour. The horizontal stabilizer on the left side is completely gone. The fuselage skin around the impact point has peeled back in both directions, creating an open wound that runs most of the way around the circumference. The tail wheel, extending from the bottom of the aft fuselage, has no floor beneath it. The pilots relay Bragg's signals to ground controllers. Bragg cannot use the radio reliably. He communicates by hand signals, relayed through the escort pilots flying alongside him, back to Biskra by radio. The exchange is slow and awkward, a chain of gestures and voices stretched across miles of sky, but it works. The base clears the runway. The ambulances and fire crews position themselves. Nobody expects the All-American to land in one piece. Bragg has one functional elevator cable and no functioning tail wheel. He also has a tail section that may or may not hold together through the stress of a landing. The forces imposed on an airframe during touchdown, even a gentle one, are considerable. A loaded B-17 touches down on its main gear at roughly 110 miles per hour, and the deceleration from that speed produces loads throughout the structure that normal flight does not. The stress will concentrate when it comes at the weakest point in the airframe. The weakest point is obvious to everyone watching. Bragg sets up the approach carefully. He knows he has limited pitch authority from the single elevator cable. He knows the aircraft wants to climb if he relaxes forward pressure on the control column. He knows that if the approach is too fast, the ground roll will be long and he may overrun the runway. If it is too slow, the aircraft will stall before the runway threshold and the result will be catastrophic. He is managing all of these competing constraints with two hands and his knees by feel on a 300-mile return flight that has already taken the better part of 90 minutes. The descent toward Biskra is controlled. Nussel's navigation has been accurate. The runway appears at the correct heading and correct distance. Bragg walks the throttles back and accepts the sink rate that results. The main gear touches the runway. The tail section shudders with the impact and sways hard to one side. The remaining attachment points hold. The aircraft decelerates down the runway, the tail bouncing and swaying as it goes, until speed bleeds away and the All-American rolls to a stop. The fire crews move in immediately. The ambulance pulls alongside. It is waved off. Every member of the crew is alive, not one of them is seriously injured. The crew members emerge from the aircraft and gather on the tarmac. The shock of what they have just experienced is visible in their faces. The ground crew and officers who have been watching the approach gather around them. Then the tail section falls off. As the last man exits the aircraft, the rear section, relieved of the weight of Sarpolis and freed from the aerodynamic forces of flight that had paradoxically been helping keep it attached, collapses to the ground. The two strips of metal that had held it in place for 300 miles and 90 minutes give way, and the entire empennage sags sideways and drops onto the Algerian desert. The aircraft that has no business being in one piece demonstrates, at last, that it was never really in one piece at all. The image that comes to define the story of All-American is not taken on the ground at Biskra. It is taken from one of the escort fighters during the final approach, a camera gun photograph, or a personal camera shot that captures the All-American in flight, with the tail section visibly hanging, the fuselage gap open, the entire rear of the aircraft bent at a slight angle from the axis of the forward section. The photograph circulates through the air forces almost immediately. It reaches the United States and is reproduced in newspapers and magazines. It becomes one of the most recognizable images of American air power in the war, used to illustrate the toughness of the B-17, the survival instincts of American airmen, the capacity of American manufacturing to build machines that refuse to quit, even when physics argued otherwise. The story that accumulates around the photograph, as photographs of remarkable events tend to accumulate stories, grows in the retelling over the following decades. By the time some post-war accounts describe it, the crew has sacrificed their parachutes to bind the tail together. The tail gunner has been rescued mid-flight by his crewmates using rope lines. The aircraft has made a 3-hour flight back to England across the Channel. One version places P-51 Mustangs alongside the aircraft over the English Channel, though the P-51 does not begin operating in the Mediterranean theater until later in 1943. Ralph Burbridge, the bombardier of the All-American, gave a detailed interview in 2012 that is the most authoritative first-person correction of these accumulated myths. Burbridge confirmed that the aircraft flew back to Biskra in Algeria, not to England. The flight was approximately 90 minutes, not 3 hours. The crew put on their parachutes after the collision, as standard emergency procedure dictated, but they did not sacrifice the parachutes to repair the aircraft. No mid-flight rope rescue of a crewman took place. The collision happened on the return leg from the target, after the bombs had already been dropped, not on the bomb run. The real story, as Burbridge told it, needs no embellishment. A B-17 had its rear fuselage nearly severed by the wing of a Bf-109G. It flew 90 minutes home with one elevator cable, 2 strips of remaining structure, a swaying tail section, and a tail gunner who stayed at his gun. Its crew shot down 4 enemy aircraft during the return flight. Its pilot landed it on one gear with no tail wheel, and the tail collapsed when the last man stepped off. Every member of the crew walked away. The All-American was repaired. This fact alone is worth noting. The aircraft that ground crews at Biskra examined after February 1st had, by any structural standard, been destroyed in the air. The fuselage was cut nearly through. Major control surfaces were gone. 2 engines were damaged beyond repair on the aircraft itself. The tail section had to be entirely replaced. The electrical, oxygen, and hydraulic systems required extensive rebuilding. The repair took weeks, but it was done because the B-17 was built to be repaired, and because the 97th Group needed aircraft, and because throwing away an airframe that could fly again was not in the culture of a wartime organization working with limited resources. When the repairs were complete, All-American was reassigned, not to the 97th. The aircraft that had become famous in the 414th Bombardment Squadron was transferred to the 352nd Bombardment Squadron of the 301st Bombardment Group at St. Dunnet, Tunisia. There, quietly and without any further notoriety, it continued to fly combat missions for another 2 years. It was dismantled for salvage at Lucera Airfield in Italy on March 6, 1945. Kendrick Bragg survived the war and returned to Georgia. He died in 1984. His widow maintained a room in their home dedicated to the story of the All-American and the events of February 1, 1943. The co-pilot, whose surname appears on the crew manifest as either Boyd or Engel, depending on how his wartime signature is read, served out the war. Navigator Harry Newsell, whose wartime letter documenting the crew roster is one of the primary sources for the story, also survived. Sam Sarpalis, the tail gunner who stayed at his gun while the fuselage was connected to the aircraft around him by 2 strips of metal, returned to the United States and lived quietly. He was not the subject of any dramatic post-war recognition. He was a sergeant who had done his job in extraordinary circumstances and had come home. The crew as a whole received no unit commendation specifically for the February 1st mission beyond what the standard after-action reports and individual decorations provided. The Army Air Forces documented the flight, preserved the photographs, and moved on to the next mission. The question that aeronautical engineers have returned to in the decades since 1943 is the one that the photograph makes most vivid. How did it fly? The technical answer begins with the B-17 structural design. The fuselage of a B-17F is not a simple tube. It is a monocoque structure, meaning that the skin carries a significant portion of the load rather than simply covering an internal skeleton. The frames and stringers distribute stress in multiple paths simultaneously, so that the failure of any one structural member does not immediately cause the failure of the structure as a whole. When Pasha's Bf-109G cut through the fuselage, it destroyed most of the structural paths in that section, but not all of them. 2 strips of the original cross-section remained intact, one near the top of the fuselage and one near the keel. Those 2 strips, carrying loads they were never designed to carry alone, held. The aerodynamic answer is related to the one elevator cable. The cable connected Bragg's control column to one side of the horizontal stabilizer through a path that ran outside the primary damage zone. It gave him pitch control, the ability to raise and lower the nose. Without any pitch control, the aircraft would have been unmanageable from the first moments after the collision. With partial pitch control, transmitted through one cable to a partial stabilizer, Bragg could fly. The operational answer is related to the crew. An aircraft with structural damage of this kind requires the pilot to manage it with extraordinary sensitivity. Every input to the controls must be modulated to avoid imposing loads that exceed what the remaining structure can handle. Bragg flew 90 minutes over 300 miles, managing an aircraft on the edge of structural failure, making turns so gentle they required 70 miles of radius, maintaining airspeed within a narrow band above stall and below the velocity at which the aerodynamic buffeting on the damaged tail would have shaken it apart. He did this by feel. by the sound of the engines and the resistance in the controls and the rhythm of the shudder coming back through the airframe, by instinct built from hundreds of hours of flying a type he had come to know as well as a man can know a machine. The engineering answer, the aerodynamics answer, and the operational answer together produced the photograph. A bomber in flight, with its tail nearly cut off, returning home. The 97th Bombardment Group continued its campaign over Tunisia through the spring of 1943. The Axis forces in North Africa surrendered on May 13, 1943, bringing the Desert War to an end. The 97th moved forward with the Allied advance into Tunisia, then supported the invasion of Sicily in July, then the invasion of the Italian mainland. By December of 1943, it was based at Cerignola in southern Italy, flying as part of the newly established 15th Air Force, ranging deep into the European continent toward targets in Austria, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Germany. The 414th Bombardment Squadron, the unit that flew the All-American, changed its unit badge after February 1, 1943. The new emblem shows a small dog preying while seated on an aircraft tail section. It is not a subtle choice of imagery. The squadron was acknowledging, in the way that military units often do through their insignia, what had happened and what it meant to the men who were there. The story of the All-American entered the wider culture of American aviation almost immediately after the photograph circulated. It was invoked as evidence of B-17 toughness throughout the war, used in training films and recruitment materials and newspaper articles, offered as proof that the Flying Fortress was exactly what its name suggested. Whether this interpretation serves the full truth of what happened is debatable. The B-17's structural integrity was real and documented in dozens of other incidents, but what happened on February 1st was not simply a demonstration of engineering. It was a demonstration of what 10 men can do when they have no other option except to keep going. Sarpolis stayed at his gun. The waist gunners stood with their heads through the hole in the fuselage to aim and fire. Bragg held the aircraft level with his knees and both hands for 90 minutes, feeling through the controls for every sign that the structure was failing, making adjustments so small they would not even register on an instrument, keeping the All-American in the air by the accumulated expertise of hundreds of hours of flying and the kind of focus that narrows the entire world to the immediate task. None of them knew, in those 90 minutes, that they would make it. They knew the math as well as any pilot who has looked at a damage assessment and run the numbers. They knew what the tail gunner could see that they could not. They knew what the waist gunners could feel through the aircraft's floor as the structure shuddered and swayed. They flew it home anyway. In 1943, a photographer in a fighter cockpit pressed a shutter at exactly the right moment and captured the result. A Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress in flight, its tail section hanging by 2 strips of metal, its crew still fighting 300 miles from home. It is one of the most famous photographs of the Second World War. It is also, at its core, a photograph of men who decided that the fact that something looked impossible was not a sufficient reason to stop trying. That is the story of the All-American.